The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Nick Cortina and I am very excited to be bringing you another Exago support lab today. We're going to be discussing all the relevant security settings that go along with Exago, and before we start digging into the meat of this here, if everyone could just start typing a Y or a yes into the questions pane, just let me know that you guys can hear me okay, and then we'll be ready to get started. Awesome, and it looks like I'm coming through okay, so we can get things rolling here. So, as I mentioned, we're going to be touching on all the relevant security settings, or what are the critical steps to ensuring security as we go about deploying Exago. Now, you'll notice that there's sort of a list of items here, and we actually have a nice fully fleshed out support site article that we're going to link in the lab description when we post this to the support site later on that covers all these topics as well. But one of the things that I did just want to touch on before we start digging into the meat of these items is you'll notice that we don't really have too much regarding the API here. And in addition, we don't really have too many things regarding multi-tenancy as well. Now, both of those items are going to be relevant when it comes to security. That said, both of those items have previously been covered and fully fleshed out in other support labs. So on that note, if after going through all the security steps here, you say, well, wait a minute, I need some API information to work with some of these other pieces or something like that, I definitely encourage you to check out those other recorded support labs. They are up on the support site if you'd like to check those out. So on that note, one last thing I should say here, our next lab is actually just going to be on April 4th. We're going to talk all about repeating data, what to do when we see repeating data, and the different things we can do in Exago to handle those types of situations. And so on that note, we'll go ahead and get started. So the first thing I want to talk about here is going to start in our admin console. So I'm just going to navigate over to one of my local installations here. And to kick things off, I'm going to open up our main settings block here, and that's just located under the General tab. And the first thing that we're going to want to do is this Temp Path. Now, you'll notice here that I've left this blank, and what that means is that this is going to use Exago's base temp folder inside of the Exago directory. And if I were to open up my file structure here, again, just looking into my program files, right, we would see that there is a temp directory here that Exago can utilize. Now, that said, the temp directory is going to contain working data used for report generation, and that means that exposing this publicly could potentially be a data security flaw. So one of the first recommendations we're going to make is that this temp path be set to a folder that you folks create that is outside the base Exago install. And that means that anyone who's trying to do some malicious directory browsing or anything like that will have a much more difficult time finding that working data. And that'll just ensure that all that information is, outside of that install and away from where anybody could erroneously get in and dig into it if they'd like. Now, the next thing we're going to mention here is actually again in the main settings. And it's going to be this setting here that says allow direct access to Exago bypassing API. Now, again, the default for this guy is true, but we're actually going to want to set this to false. And what exactly does that mean in terms of Exago? Well, setting this to false means that I can't just use a full URL to get to my base Exago web installation. And that's actually really important because your host application is going to handle all of the authentication. Exago doesn't really do any of that, right? While we handle authorization, determining which users can see which set of reports, which folders, etc., we don't do the authentication. That's your host app's responsibility. Now, if we allow a user to bypass the API calls, and the API is really where the host app gets to tell Exago and say, hey, this is the user that's logging in, so that Exago can handle all the authorization. If a user can access Exago and bypass the API, they could potentially get around all of those security pieces that we put in place. So setting this to false ensures that going through the host application's authentication protocol is the only way to launch Exago. And so for that reason, we want this guy to be set to false. The next piece here is going to be in the Other Settings block. So I'm going to close my main settings and just open the Other Settings, again, located under this General category. And the next piece we're going to recommend is down here on this User ID and Password. Now, the User ID and Password are set to disallow access to the admin console if you don't know the User ID and Password combination. Now, this is really just sort of a good idea. One of the things we're going to talk about in just a second is how we actually remove this from the production environment, this being the admin console altogether. However, even just for your dev or staging environment, it's probably a good idea to ensure that nobody can just get into the admin console if they'd like, and that only your verified administrators are going to be able to access that. The other key thing I would say here is you'll notice this REST key setting. And so for anyone who's leveraging the REST API for their integration, I would say this is really important to generate this REST key. And in the authorization header, utilize this REST key, and that's going to ensure that those REST calls have that additional layer of security. Now, I did just mention, right, while we want to set a user ID and password on this admin console, it's really a security best practice from the Exago standpoint to not have an admin console exposed in production. And so I'm going to navigate back to the file structure of my Exago installation again to touch on some of these pieces. And as I navigate into my config folder, as a quick refresher, we'll see the admin console is really just building this web reports XML file. And this XML file holds all the configuration that Exago needs when it actually goes to run and generate a new session. Now, the interesting thing is, we don't ever actually have to touch the admin console. If we felt savvy enough and wanted to directly edit the XML of this to establish our configuration, we absolutely could. And to take that a step further and tie that back to our security, when the production environment that you guys are going to have goes to spin up a new session of Exago, the only thing it needs to generate that session is the encrypted copy of the configuration file. And you might be saying, okay, well, if the admin console makes this web reports XML file, how do we make that encrypted copy? Looking back at the admin console for just a second, every time we hit this apply button, a new copy of the encrypted file is going to be generated for the Exago, or for Exago's next sessions, I should say, to then utilize. So to take that a step further, one of our best practices is that we say, hey, we recommend maintaining a QA testing staging environment, right? Whatever your terminology is there, where you can go in and try out new features, test everything out, make sure everything's working as intended. And in that staging environment, we'd recommend including the admin console so that you can make tweaks as necessary, right? And again, that's going to be behind your firewalls. You're not exposing it publicly, so it's not going to be as much of an issue or a security flaw there. However, when we move to production, and we're going to potentially expose this thing over the public internet, right? We don't want to include this plain text web reports XML file in that production environment. And as we mentioned, if all Exago needs is this encrypted copy of the file to generate a new session, when we're getting ready to move to production, we recommend copying the encrypted web reports XML file from your test or staging environment, moving that over to your production config folder, and then deleting the plain text XML config file altogether. Now, keeping in mind, right, this config file is going to have some data source information and some of that good stuff. So exposing that in plain text means that any old user who digs into that file is going to be able to access your data source. And obviously that's going to be a security flaw, right? So ensuring that only the encrypted XML file is included in production is going to ensure that no malicious user can dig in and get access to your data sources when in fact they really shouldn't. Now, again, we just talked a little bit about how we can move just the encrypted copy of that file over, and I did touch on the fact that the admin console doesn't actually need to be exposed in production. So in tandem with saying, hey, just show that encrypted copy in the production environment, right? So that Exago can use the encrypted version to generate new sessions and do all that. The other thing we'd say is we want to make sure that no user in the production environment can get to an admin console. And so in order to ensure that, I'm going to, again, just navigate back into my Exago installation. And so here, navigating outside of the config folder back into the base install, we can remove the admin.aspx page, but that's actually not going to be enough to remove access to the admin console itself. Interestingly enough, one of the things that we could do is just modify the ASPX page to maybe have a simple user message saying something like, hey, looks like you got here by mistake, or something of the like. Alternatively, we could remove it altogether. But at the end of the day, whatever you folks choose, the key to actually ensure that no one can get to the admin console is to navigate first into the bin directory and see this admin.aspx file. We want to actually delete this guy from the Exago installation altogether. And again, we're only going to do this in the production environment. In our QA and staging, it's okay to leave this stuff because we're not exposing that information publicly. And, the other thing I would say is your admins want to be able to use that admin tool because, at the end of the day, we could just edit the XML ourselves, and obviously that would still work. But that being said, hey, I'm not an XML wizard. I think it'd be a lot easier if I could just use this nice simple interface that Exago has built for us to generate this config. And so in that regard, in the staging environment, we want to leave this stuff accessible. But when we actually go to production, that's going to be where we want to delete this admin.aspx compiled file. And again, that's just located in the bin directory of the base Exago install. Okay, it looks like we're doing pretty good on questions so far, so I'm going to keep going here. Now, at this point, we've touched on all of the fundamental security pieces for the base Exago installation, but there's a couple other pieces that go along with this, particularly with the scheduler, as well as with the API. So let's first touch on the scheduling component. So I'm actually going to navigate and open up two things here for us. One is a new scheduler installation that we're going to look at, and one is a web API installation. So we can take a look at both of these in just a second here. Now, when using the scheduler, in a similar manner to the base Exago web application, when we generate given reports, there's going to be some working data that we use to populate those reports. And in the base Exago web app, we saw that that stuff gets saved to that temp directory. And so, as we recall earlier, we said, hey, we want to make sure that that is set outside that base Exago installation to ensure the security there. For the scheduler, we're going to go through sort of something of a similar process, but we're going to actually handle this case a little bit differently. So if I navigate into my Exago scheduler directory, we're going to notice this eWeb Reports Scheduler XML file. So this is almost the equivalent to that Web Reports XML file for the base Exago install. Now, thankfully, if we open this one up with, say, Notepad++ here, and I think I'll just zoom in just a little to make this a little more legible, we'll notice that, yep, it's still XML that we're editing, but thankfully this is only 29 lines, so, not as much to manage here. But one of the key things that we're going to do here is we'll notice that for our scheduler files, these are actually going to get saved to a working directory in the scheduler installation. And so one of the best practices that we're going to say here is those files that get saved to that working directory for that scheduler, we want to make sure that those get encrypted. And so setting this encrypt schedule files to true will ensure that that actually happens. One important thing to note here is that if we have multiple instances of the scheduler, perhaps for load balancing or something of the like, we're going to need to make sure that this setting is applied for each and every eWebReports scheduler.xml file for each of those schedulers that are being utilized. So That's going to help ensure that all of the scheduler's working data is encrypted and secure. But the final piece here, in terms of the security settings, is going to be a little more related to the APIs. And in fact, it's actually not necessarily related to the .NET or the REST APIs that you folks are utilizing for your integration, but for our deprecated SOAP API, which is what folks used to use before we started to fully flesh out our REST API. So navigating into the Exago Web API folder, we're going to see that we have an API.asmx page, and this is where we could navigate to get information about all the various methods and things that the deprecated SOAP API would offer us. And so, again, a good idea here would probably be to edit the information on this page to say something like, hey, looks like you got here erroneously, or something of the like, because again, we want to make sure that we're not exposing any information so that, again, a malicious end user can't come in and say, script some SOAP API calls to get information from your Exago installation. Now, the other thing I would say is, while again, we can modify the API.asmx page and do custom error messages or something like that if we wanted, really the key here is that we should probably just remove the access to the SOAP API altogether. And in order to do that, we'll navigate into the bin directory of the Exago Web API install. And we're actually going to go ahead and look for the API.asmx compiled file here. And deleting this file ensures that the SOAP API is fully disabled. And again, the key here is that you don't want to allow anybody to try and execute given API calls against your installation, because on the off chance that they format it correctly and get everything right, they could potentially get some data back that maybe they really shouldn't. And so on that note, that's why we recommend disabling the deprecated SOAP API. So at this point, we've gone through all of the relevant security settings to ensure that Exago is going to be, well, secure in your production environment. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we do have a security checklist on the support site, and we'll make sure to include a link to this on the recording that we post on our site here as well. But the nice part I would say here is that all of the various steps we talked about today are going to be listed out here. So if you didn't take notes or you don't want to sift back through the recording, you're more than welcome to take a look at this article, and it's going to list out all those steps that I just walked through, again, just in a nice, easy place for you to access here. So on that note, we'll take a few extra minutes. If anyone does have any questions or anything, feel free to post those and we'll answer those here. But thank you folks so much for tuning in today, and happy reporting.